So at CIRA, we're celebrating our 10th anniversary today. On December 1st, 2000, the registry was cut over from its initial operator, the University of British Columbia. And here I have with me today John Demco, who is essentially the godfather of the .ca registry and the person at UBC who was responsible for operating and managing the .ca registry until it was cut over to us 10 years ago. John continues to serve on the board of directors for CIRA, and he's also a director at WebNames, one of our largest registrar partners. So John, thank you for founding .ca. We certainly appreciate it. So take us back to 1987 when the internet was in its infancy and you started the .ca.
It was interesting times. It was much simpler times, as I suppose you can imagine. In fact, although the internet, depending on how you measure it, got started in 1969 or maybe 1982. 1982 is when the protocol transition took place from the NCP to TCP/IP in around about the 1982 time frame. So I think the folks that were involved back then see that as basically sort of day zero for the internet as we know it now. So back 1987 was 5 years after that. The total internet size was on the order of a few thousand machines in total.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, extremely small. And in fact, there was a large proliferation of other kinds of networks in the world. So it's not as if the internet was what everybody used, as small as it was for email communications and research communications and commercial communications. There were a lot of purpose-built networks. So it was a simpler time in some ways. In some ways, it was a much more diverse, uncertain time, and it was a great time to be involved with getting something started like this. I appreciate the congratulations. I also want to emphasize that this is not just me. There were a lot of people involved with this process, and I just happened to be at the right place at the right time.
Did you and your colleagues at that time did you have any sense of what the internet was going to be? Did you think that it was going to be everywhere and everybody was going to be using it by this time?
I guess one way to put this would be the short answer would be no. A slightly longer answer, I guess, would be that even though it was small back then, if you looked at the numbers and charted the growth, it was exponential. Right from the first time I started looking at numbers for numbers of hosts on the internet, numbers of organizations in Canada connected to the net, numbers of people involved with the network, small but growing exponentially. So it might have been a blip, but on the other hand, if you just extrapolate those external exponential numbers, it doesn't take very long before you see you're into a significant percentage of the population.
So take us back. How did the .ca get started? How did you actually come to getting it and starting it and being interested in it?
I was at the University of British Columbia. I was a grad student and then a member of the staff, and I was involved. My research interest was actually in naming and distributed computer systems and in networks. And as I mentioned, there were this variety of networks in the world and in particular in Canada, and they weren't all compatible. And in particular, it was a challenge to do things like send email from somebody on one network to somebody on another network. There was a challenge to send files back and forth. It's not as if there weren't any standards. There was no lack of standards.
There was just a lot of them. Right?
Yeah, the great thing about standards, there are so many of them. And that's the way it was back then, that's for sure. So so one of the things that I happened to notice was that, one way to try to get people on these different networks to be able to communicate more easily would be to see, is there some lowest common denominator naming scheme that we can, if not use directly, at least map into fairly straightforwardly, so that it would take one of these barriers to communication down a little bit. And the domain name system had recently been invented around about the same 1982 time frame, and it was a fairly straightforward hierarchical naming scheme, and I thought that held a lot of promise. So I looked into it a little further, found out that there were TLDs, and there were the original GTLDs were in the 1985 time frame, and Jonathan Postel, who was the IANA, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, was the fellow who was in charge of assigning country code top-level domain names. So I got in touch with him. Unfortunately, I don't have the email trail that I had with him. I never met the man in person. Unfortunately, he died in 1998, so I'll never get a chance to meet him. And exchanged email with him. He was interested in being sure that as sure as he could be, that the person that he transferred authority of a domain to would be able to manage it responsibly and in conjunction with the other appropriate organizations and people and institutions in the country. I somehow managed to convince him of that, and in fact I had been working with representatives from the different formal and informal networks in Canada. He sent me some emails saying we had a little bit of a discussion. Should it be .ca? Should it be .cdn? Should it be
Really?
.can?
Okay.
Yeah, and part of the justification for that was that it was a really small internet world back then, and we were not concerned, but we discussed about the possibility of some confusion choosing .ca and whether the person on the street would anywhere in the world would say, is that Canada or is that California or
Right.
or whatever. And the United Kingdom had already broken the rules by getting .uk, where their official two-letter country code was actually GB at the time. But they convinced Postel to get .uk, and I can understand the reasoning behind that. So we had that discussion. We ended up back where we started with .ca anyway, and it was delegated on May 14th, 1987. And onward and upward.
Right. Wow, what a great piece of history. So why do you think it's so important for Canada to have .ca in terms of Canada's place in the world? Why does it matter?
It's interesting. It's almost as if it's so important that there actually hasn't been a lot of discussion about that. When these smaller networks were in place in Canada, there was one of the networks was called BitNet, and it was a computing center network. The Canadian version of it wasn't just BitNet, it was Net North. Although it could well have been just an extension of BitNet, and technically it was. It just was a natural thing that it be a different network. The network that I was involved with, CDNNet, they just sort of naturally evolved on national lines, the internet as a technology certainly doesn't really care much about national boundaries, but people strongly identify with national domain names, and I think that's one of the great strengths of .ca right from the very beginning.
Right, it's kind of like having the flag sewn onto your backpack in the virtual world.
It absolutely is, yeah.
So take us back to really the early days. I mean, I've heard the rumor that the .ca registry was run from a computer under your desk, basically. Is that true?
Well, in the very beginning of .ca, where I pulled together a committee of representatives from these different networks, there was no internet established in Canada at the time. So the one fact that maybe not well known was that the primary name server for .ca at the very beginning, for the first half year or so, was actually in the United States. It was because we didn't have adequate internet connectivity in Canada, and what's the point of having a name server for a domain if you can't get to the name server from the internet? We had a really good relationship with the American network called CSNet, which was evolving into the support center for the NSFnet, which was then, long story short, ultimately absorbed into VeriSign, and so the original name server for .ca was actually in Boston, or in the Boston area. And as soon as we got connectivity to UBC in the May timeframe of about a year later, right as soon as possible after that, we moved the name server to the primary to UBC, and we set up secondaries in Toronto and in Montreal at the major universities at U of T and at McGill, and then expanded from there. The registry itself, yeah, it was run on a single machine. I remember when some of the original CIRA board, the bootstrap board that wasn't involved with, weren't yet elected. One of these guys was a lawyer, and he came out to UBC and he wanted to see the the primary name server of the registry for .ca, and it was a pizza box server in one of the machine rooms that we had in the computer science department. He said, and I showed him this thing, a little tiny thing about an inch high and 19.5 inches wide. He said, "That's it?" Well, that's the way it goes. You know, some of these things aren't very impressive visually, but very, very impressive in what actually happened.
And we just passed 1.5 million .ca domains, a pretty significant milestone and unbelievable when you think back to where it all started.
Yeah.
Did you ever think it would be that popular? I mean, I know we talked about the exponential growth of the internet per se, but did you ever think .ca would have 1.5 million domains when you only had one pizza box server?
I wasn't thinking in terms of numbers like that. I guess I didn't really conceive that the net and .ca would become so pervasive. But in retrospect, looking back, I guess I'm not too surprised. We've been watching the growth ever since the beginning, and in particular after CIRA took over the operational transfer from UBC, the growth was just tremendously strong at that point. So, and with the commercialization of the network the net that happened in the early 90s, and the availability of the World Wide Web, it's like electricity basically. So yeah, I guess short answer is yes and no. Am I surprised? Right. Yes, but no.
So I mean, the next 10 years, what do you think some of the key challenges for either the internet or for the .ca registry itself are going to be?
I think everybody out there probably can pick great challenges and opportunities for the internet. I think the internet, generally speaking, is becoming more and more part of the fabric of society, and therefore reflecting all the good things and many, unfortunately, of the bad things of society. Although there are issues with security and with privacy and a lot of you can view these things in a negative light if you want. One measure that I always have is would I rather have the internet or not?
Right.
I think the answer
pretty
to
good,
that,
simple, straightforward test. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've come so far, but we're just getting started.
That's a very interesting comment. As somebody who's literally been there since the beginning, when you look back, how do you feel?
Like I mentioned earlier, I feel so fortunate that I've been involved with this process for as long as I have, and to have such a supportive group, both at UBC and at CIRA and in the community. It's been such a great experience. I can't imagine having had a more fulfilling career being involved with this.
It is an absolutely incredible career, and well, first off, I want to thank you for having done it and all of the hard work that clearly that was, and also for all the contributions you made to CIRA for the past 10 years, above and beyond all of the hard work you did before CIRA. Truly appreciate it, and listening to your story there, certainly understand why you have the nickname the godfather of .ca. Thanks very much, John.
Thanks, Byron.